sir. Good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a self-defense case. Each piece of evidence that's presented during the course of this trial will show one thing, and one thing very clearly. This is self-defense. It's one man defending himself against an attack by another man. The man who defended himself was Tai Chan. The man who attacked him was Jeremy Martin. Two young cops in a life or death struggle. Mr. Chan is ultimately able to get the pistol and begins to fire to save his life. Now, counsel kind of glosses over some very, very important facts that you're going to hear and you're going to see.
This is an opening statement, and again, don't refer to the other party.
Thank you, Your Honor. There are facts that you're going to hear and see that become so very important during the course of this trial that it is unavoidable to miss. You will not be able to miss the nature, the struggle, the violence that took place in the hotel room immediately prior to the gunshots being fired. Now, remember when you're hearing the evidence, this can't be judged in a vacuum. This event can't be judged in a vacuum. You have to understand and you have to look at each part during the run-up to the shooting. About 11:30, these two men return back to the hotel. Not only will Mr. Chan tell you what happened in the hotel room, but hotel guests will tell you what happened as well. What they heard, what they saw. What the hotel guests will tell you is, rather than a quiet evening, what they hear is crashing and banging and screaming and yelling. One hotel guest will tell you that it sounded like a body being thrown against the wall. It sounded like furniture being smashed. This was before the shot was fired. This was before the shots were ultimately fired. What you're going to hear is a security guard named Mr. Zamora talk about how the individuals were arguing with one another on the way up the elevator before they go into the hotel room, 7-Eleven, where the fight began. You're going to hear direct testimony from the next door neighbors, the people in the room next door. There were 3 people in the room next door, and each one of them is exceedingly consistent about the nature and duration of this fight, which we now know was between Jeremy Martin and Tai Chan. You'll see photographs of a blood-soaked bed. You'll hear testimony from Mr. Chan about the nature of the conflict. Mr. Chan is going to tell you that Mr. Martin kicked him in the groin, that he punched him in the nose, causing his nose to bleed, that he forced him to the ground, punching him in the back of the head, that Mr. Martin took Mr. Chan's head and smashed it into the bed as if to suffocate him. There was a struggle for the pistol. The first shot goes into the ceiling. Now, I'm not making this up. You're going to hear from the experts in this case, both the state and other ones, that the forensic evidence in this case is consistent with, not what the state would have you believe, but Mr. Chan's testimony. For instance, when Mr. Chan tells you that Mr. Martin was armed, the DNA and the forensics evidence confirms that. The gun that was fired had 2 sources of DNA on it, Mr. Chan's and Mr. Martin's.
Mr. DeAntonio, do you have that, Judge?
Yes, I do, Judge.
Approach the bench.
was saying, ladies and gentlemen,
Mr. Clark, let me admonish the jury again. There is going to be a different perspective in terms of what the evidence is and what the evidence will show. What is being told to you, both by Mr. D'Antonio and by Mr. Clark, is what they expect the evidence to show. And again, I have to emphasize, what they tell you in their opening statements is not evidence. You will hear all of the evidence. And what the parties tell you in their opening statements, they're going to have to be able to support in terms of the presentation of the evidence. There is perhaps disagreement in terms of what the evidence will show. That's why it's the court's responsibility to emphasize what you're hearing now is not the evidence yet. Go ahead, Mr. Clark.
thank you. As I was saying, the firearm in question in this case was taken into custody and was sent off to the state crime lab. It was swabbed for DNA. The gun, you will hear, evidence will show, whether that witness is called by the state or whether that witness is called by the defense is up in the air at this point. But you will hear an analyst from the state crime lab tell you that there are two sources of DNA on this pistol. One is Mr. Chan and one belongs to Mr. Martin. Likewise, you're going to hear discussions from forensic analysis, of a forensic analysis that will confirm or show that Mr. Chan is telling you the truth of his recitation of a fight over the pistol. You're going to hear that the first shot, when the gun went off, it went into the ceiling at an angle, a 45-degree angle, suggesting that Mr. Chan is in a lower position, perhaps on his knees, perhaps crouching, when the gun goes off during a struggle. You're also going to hear that all of the blood in room 711 belongs to Tai Chan. You're also going to hear that the pattern of blood on the bed suggests pooling, which suggests that Mr. Martin had Mr. Chan's head smashed into the bed sheet, smashed into the comforter, causing blood to flow from both nostrils and stain the bed sheet. When you hear that Mr. Chan was scared for his life, when Mr. Chan tells you, I was frightened for my life, I thought I was going to be killed, the evidence in this case suggests, the evidence in this case confirms that Mr. Chan was being throttled. Mr. Chan was being beaten. Mr. Chan was being assaulted by the very law enforcement officer that he had been partnered with. Now, as the judge told you, this case is going to take 2 weeks. It's going to be a myriad of witnesses, exhibits by the dozens and dozens, videos perhaps, experts, civilian witnesses, law enforcement officers. So when you're cautioned by the court that what we say now is not evidence, that's absolutely right. It's what we believe the evidence will show. The purpose of opening statements is to give you a roadmap of how this is going to unfold. It's to give you kind of a preview of coming attractions as to what our prospective points of view might be and what we believe ultimately will be the evidentiary foundation for you to base your ultimate conclusion or your ultimate decision. This is a very serious case. We have two young police officers on a routine transport. They worked together, they weren't friends, that's true. Now, one is dead, and Mr. Chan stands accused of murdering him. They were both employed by the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Department, and you're going to learn that they both had good track records. One of the first witnesses will be their commanding officer. He's going to tell you they were both good officers. He's going to tell you that they were both well trained. They're both about the same age. They both have basically the same training. They were both in possession of weapons that night. You're going to hear that in the room there were 3 guns. Mr. Martin carried a Glock 357 as his service pistol. Mr. Chan also carried a Glock 357 as his service weapon. And then Mr. Martin had what we would call a holdout gun, or an extra gun in the room. It was a smaller, more compact Springfield 9mm. So when you hear that Mr. Martin was unarmed, remember that is one side's version, and we believe you're going to hear differently. Not only, as I've told you, there are 2 sources of DNA on the pistol that killed Mr. Martin, but Mr. Martin also was in the possession of his service weapon as well as his holdout or extra gun. Now, you're going to hear, as the state told you, and there's going to be very little dispute about the day and the night and the evening in question during the run-up to the shooting. Mr. Chan actually went to school here in Las Cruces. He went to college here before he decided to become a law enforcement officer. So one of the reasons that they decided to go out that night in Las Cruces was because Mr. Chan had friends here and he had a cousin. And so you're going to hear very detailed testimony from the individuals who went out with Mr. Chan and Mr. Martin. You're going to hear where they went. You're going to hear how they were behaving. You're going to hear how much each individual drank. You're going to hear how they got to the bars and how they got home. You're going to hear that they bickered, that Mr. Martin was picking at Mr. Chan throughout the night, that there was something wrong with Mr. Martin, something was bothering him. Nobody was really particularly certain. They seemed to be arguing about something professionally, but consistent with all of the individuals who had contact with these guys on this night was that Mr. Martin, there was something wrong with Mr. Martin. He was angry, he was bickering, he seemed to be just upset about something. You're also going to hear that at the end of the evening of drinking, Mr. Chan's cousin actually drove Mr. Martin and Mr. Chan back to the Hotel Encanto. And that Mr. Chan's level of intoxication was so high that Mr. Martin actually had to help him out of the car and walk him into the hotel. This is from not only Mr. Chan's cousin, but also other employees from the hotel are going to tell you that they entered the hotel, they seemed to be almost arm in arm, and they got on the elevator and they went up. You're also going to hear from a security guard that after they first arrived at the hotel, there was some dispute in the room, and Mr. Chan actually left the room and left the hotel. And Mr. Martin pursued him. Perhaps through video footage, perhaps through telephone conversations, perhaps through eyewitnesses, you're going to hear that Tai Chan fled the hotel and that Mr. Martin went after him. A security guard is going to tell you, among other things, that Mr. Martin appeared to be desperately looking for him. And he found him. And Mr. Martin takes Mr. Chan back to the elevator, takes him back upstairs. That same security guard is going to tell you that they were arguing. He couldn't tell about what, but they seemed to be fighting about something. And they went back into room 711. Witnesses will then tell you that's when the fight started. The crashing, the banging, the screaming, the yelling, and then the boom, 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 and the shots. So when it is articulated to you that this just happened like that it was all quiet, and then the shooting started, that's not what the evidence is going to show. This was a relatively lengthy, protracted run-up to what became a deadly case of self-defense. Mr. Chan will testify, and you will hear in his own words exactly what happened on the evening in question. He's going to tell you that he felt threatened, that he was indeed threatened with a firearm, that a gun was pointed at him, and then Mr. Martin told him, "I'm going to murder you." He's going to tell you that he was pummeled in the face, his head was smashed into the bed, that he thought he was going to die. They fought for the gun. Once he finally got control of the gun during the course of this fight, he just started shooting to protect himself. Now, there is not going to be any mystery about the distances between these two men during when the first shot's fired, when the second volley, when the first volley of shots is fired, and then when the last volley of shots is fired. You're going to hear experts agree that the entire incident, from the time the first shot goes off into the ceiling until Mr. Martin runs down the hallway and enters the elevator, is about 25 seconds. 25 seconds from start to finish. You're also going to hear and you're going to see the dimensions of this hotel room. And you're going to see and hear that the entire distance from the edge of the bed, it's a wall at the edge of the bed, to the door that Mr. Martin went out and Mr. Chan went behind him, is 8.5 feet. You're going to hear that when the first shots were fired, these gentlemen were probably between 4 and 5 feet apart, immediately following a life or death struggle. And the point where the last shots were fired was no more than 11.5 feet. So these are dimensions that our experts agree on, that the maximum time of this event was about 25 seconds, and the total distance was 11.5 feet. We're talking about an event that happened in the blink of an eye, that happened within a few feet of one another. You're never going to hear that Mr. Chan chased Mr. Martin down the hall shooting him. Quite the opposite. What you're going to hear is that all shots were fired from a stationary position. You're not going to hear that Mr. Chan somehow stood over Mr. Martin in the elevator and executed him. That's not the facts. Why do I know this? Because I rely on the science. I rely on the experts. I rely on the testimony. I rely on the people who can establish these things beyond a reasonable doubt. After Mr. Chan was forced to defend himself, was forced to discharge his weapon to save his life, he went door to door in the hallway, knocking on doors, yelling out, "Law enforcement, call 911, call the police." You're going to hear multiple witnesses tell you that immediately after the shooting stopped, an individual, who we now know to be Mr. Chan, was banging on doors. One witness, a gentleman who's a warden for the penitentiary system, will tell you that what he heard come out of Mr. Chan's mouth was, "Call 911, call 911, call the police." It's also important to know that the weapon that Mr. Chan had, is the Glock I'm talking about, holds 15 rounds. There were 5 still left in the chamber. So rather than pursuing Mr. Martin, as the state might suggest to you happened in this case, Mr. Chan immediately sought help, immediately asked for assistance, immediately identified himself as law enforcement, and asked that the police be called. Rather than pursuing Mr. Martin down the elevator, Mr. Chan goes into the stairwell, which can be described as a defensive position, and awaits for law enforcement to arrive. He waited there. When law enforcement came up the stairwell, you'll hear an audio of a dog barking. You'll hear Mr. Chan identify himself as law enforcement, identify himself by his badge number, and identify that he is indeed armed, and the police tell him to drop the weapon. He puts it down, and he goes into custody. After Mr. Chan is taken into custody, some crazy things are said. You'll likely hear the audio Crazy things about a bomb, crazy things about people floating past through the air as if Mr. Chan was hallucinating. But you'll also hear him say very clearly, I didn't have a choice. I did this in self-defense. When Mr. Chan was taken into custody, you'll hear that he asked for a lawyer, and he was denied a lawyer by the Las Cruces Police Department. He said, I don't want to talk to the police, and I want my attorney. And for many hours, he was denied a lawyer. Now, what the motivation of that was, I don't know, but it happened.
Is there an objection, Mr. D'Antonio?
Yes, Your Honor. Then approach the bench.
After Mr. Chan was placed into custody and requested a lawyer, the investigation began. And the investigation focused on first-degree murder. The evidence will show you it focused on Mr. Chan and first-degree murder. And the evidence will also show you, we believe, that the Las Cruces Police Department botched this investigation at every turn. They made a decision on what had happened, who the perpetrator was, and they never looked back. You're going to hear during the course of this trial how, as the investigation began to unfold, the Las Cruces Police Department was giving every opportunity to rethink what happened in this case. They get the result, the forensics back on the pistol, and it's determined that there are sources of 2 DNA on the pistol. Well, certainly that supports, we believe the evidence will show that supports our theory of self-defense. They get the initial blood results back from the sheet, Tai Chan's blood on the sheet. We believe they had the opportunity to re-examine their view of this case. They didn't do so. They continued to move forward. You're going to hear that the blood-soaked comforter was not tested in this case until June of 2016. This shooting happened in October of 2014. The Las Cruces Police Department waited 22 months to test the comforter, which turned out to be saturated with Tai Chan's blood. Nobody ever looked back. They made their decision, we believe the evidence will show, and they never looked back, ignoring piece of evidence after piece of evidence after piece of evidence that was contrary to their original charging. So,
Mr. Clark, the court has given you a direction. It's an outline, as you indicated.
yes, sir.
It's a roadmap.
At the close of the case, close of the evidence, you're going to return to the jury room. Then and only then you'll begin discussing the evidence you see here over the next 2 weeks. You'll weigh the facts, you'll receive jury instructions. Jury instructions will be given to you. It's the law of the case. The judge will give these to you. They're written. You'll go through them. You'll understand them. And then you'll make your determination. The state is going to ask you to consider first-degree murder. And if you don't think it's first-degree murder, the state's going to ask you to consider second-degree murder. If you don't think it's second-degree murder, they're going to ask you to consider voluntary manslaughter. It's a step down. The burden rests on the state to prove this case.
Judge, may I approach, Judge?
No, you don't have to. You're being argumentative.
I apologize, Your Honor.
You have to stop that.
I apologize.
The argumentation is at the closing statement, not now. Once you've gone beyond what the evidence is going to present, you're making a comment in terms of standards. Again, you're making comments on what may or may not result depending on how the judge rules.
I'll rephrase my question, Judge. And I'm almost done.
Mr. D'Antonio, is there another issue?
Yes, Your Honor, there is.
Then approach. Again, from time to time, and probably quite a few times, I'm going to ask the attorneys to approach the bench, or they're going to ask the court to approach the bench. This is so that we can have a discussion to where the jury cannot hear the discussion. So rather than getting you up every single time that I ask people to approach, or the attorneys to approach, just don't focus in on the discussion that we're having up here, please.
Thank you. At the end of the evidence, at the end of the case, you're going to deliberate. When you return to the jury room, you will see, based on the evidence, nothing else, that Mr. Chan is an innocent man. Mr. Chan acted in self-defense. As a result, you will have but one choice, but to find Mr. Chan not guilty in this case. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Clark. Before we bring forward the first witness, we have to reorient the courtroom here. So let's go ahead and take a short recess, and then we'll bring you back in for a minute for the testimony.
Please rise to the jury.
Thank you. Take your seats.